for joining us to this month's SIG webinar featuring MacKenzie Smith. Just as a reminder for those who are new to the webinar series that during the webinar only the host and presenters will have their microphones enabled, so use the chat window to type in your questions or to communicate with others. Presentations in the series are approximately 50 minutes in length. We will actually break several times during this talk for questions and answers, but also we'll have our usual Q&A session following during the remaining time after the talk. Lastly, today's webinar is being recorded and will be available for on-demand viewing through geodynamics.org. Okay, today's talk brings us a bit of change from our usual technical talks, but is a topic that comes up frequently in conversation within our own community within the context of recognizing software's role in science and receiving professional merit. Our speaker today is MacKenzie Smith. She is the University Librarian at UC Davis. An academic research librarian since 1985, MacKenzie specializes in information technology and digital knowledge management and spent most of her career at the libraries of MIT and Harvard University. As research director for the MIT libraries, she led cutting-edge projects in digital libraries and archives, web applications for online scholarly communication, and digital data curation in support of e-science. She also led the development of the DSpace open source software platform for digital archives, now used by hundreds of universities worldwide and managed by a nonprofit organization based in Cambridge. For the U.S. Association of Research Libraries, she designed and led an eScience Institute to help research libraries develop strategic plans to support data-intensive research. She was also a research fellow for the Creative Commons, working on intellectual property policy for scientific research data and advocacy for open access to scholarly journals and other research products. At UC Davis, MacKenzie is coordinating campus support for data management, including library services for data curation and helping launch a new data science initiative. Today, she'll be talking to us on several issues becoming of increasing importance to our community on software publishing and reproducibility. So MacKenzie, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Lorraine, for that kind introduction, and welcome everybody to this webinar. And I am new to this particular group, so forgive me if I devolve into jargon from my own field. And I would encourage you to ask questions at any point, really, since we are a very small group today. But there are a couple of breaks in the presentation where I'll pause and just make sure everybody's with me. So with that, I'm going to put my slides up and get started. So the talk today is, as Lorraine said, on software and data, which are closely related, as you'll see, and the scholarly record, which reproducibility is a major reason for having and driver for, and something that I've been working on, for my whole career, really. So the premise of this presentation is that modeling and other forms of computational science require that software be shared and preserved for the future, in part to ensure reproducibility of research and to make sure that credit is given where credit is due for the contribution of software to the research process. So this webinar is going to review some aspects of sharing software and data, including some of the things that you've been tackling, I know, from talking to Lorraine and other colleagues on open source licensing and software publishing or sharing. So with that, I think I need to start by offering my humble apologies and all due credit to Victoria Stodden. The first section of this presentation is really flagrantly plagiarized from her work on scientific reproducibility. And if you want more details and more information, I encourage you to check out her website, which the URL for is provided here. And also, some of this presentation is based on work by Phil Bourne, who was at UC San Diego for many years and is now a brand new director of data sciences at the NIH and has also thought a lot about this topic, and many others whose work I will be describing in part without credit. So the agenda today is 3 sections. The first is on reproducibility and why are we even talking about this now? Why should you care? The second part is on some of the logistical issues of actually sharing your code or publishing your code and your data. And then finally, just a few thoughts about some of the challenges we have in long-term preservation of things like software and data as part of that scholarly record. So to begin with, I think everybody in this group is painfully aware of the revolution in science, really, that is being driven by a few phenomena. One is enormous and increasing amounts of data. So there are just a few examples there. The Large Hadron Collider Project generating 5.2 million seconds of runtime data a year, 780 terabytes a year, and increasing rapidly. The Sloan Digital Sky Survey generated 60 terabytes in its last release, and that also is going up every year. In social science, we have a quantitative revolution, and things like social network data are taking over. So we have been asked repeatedly to do things like store the entire archive of Twitter for social science research mining. And as I said, just in the last month, the NIH has appointed a new associate director for data science to help them develop strategies around this issue, because data is just becoming a huge problem for us, really, to manage. And with that has come increasing computational power, high performance computing and the like, with massive simulations like the ones that you all run, happening on an increasingly frequent basis. And the point, I guess, of this is that in this computational power and increasing amount of data, there are deep intellectual contributions which are not actually published in the traditional sense, but are only captured really in the software itself or in the data itself, which is leading to this reproducibility crisis. The rationale for reproducibility is, again, nothing new to anybody here. Our basis for science involves skepticism requiring that all scientific claims be verifiable. The process has to be transparent and the communication has to be visible so that people know how the research was done and exactly, well, ideally be able to reproduce it themselves. This theory goes back to the very beginnings of science and the Enlightenment and is still an incredibly important premise of science today. What's changed is that the advances in technology that we just talked about, used for scientific discovery, are changing how science works, and that has knock-on effects on how we do reproduction of research. So the main thing is this notion that there is really a new branch of science, computational science, which has really been around for quite a while, but began to be broadly recognized as something new and different in the late 2000s. So as you know, historically speaking, there have been two branches of the scientific method, the deductive and the inductive. Both of them required formal articulation of theories and methods that were used to actually test theories. And those were encapsulated in research articles and similar kinds of communication methods. Now we have these new branches of science, which are roughly categorized as computational science and data science, depending on who you're talking to, which agency, which journal. And the problem is, are these really new branches of science, given that we have this requirement that science be reproducible to be believable and trustworthy? And Victoria Stodden and others have argued that really today, these new branches of science are not new branches yet, because we don't have standards for how to communicate them and assess them without these ways of validating the research. And you see more and more that there are just a plethora of errors emerging, of which the scientific method is the way of finding out what's wrong with the research that was done. So in the deductive branch of science, you have the concept of a proof, which nobody would publish a mathematical article without including that. And then on the empirical side, you have the whole machinery of hypothesis testing, and that is, again, encoded in your methods section and your protocols in your research articles so that other people can go home and try it at home. Computational science works very differently. And Victoria and others have observed over and over that instead of rigorous methodologies and widespread reproducibility, you have these breezy demos. that show visualizations of the research without really any way of probing deeper to see what really is going on. And that access to the code and data that produce those demos would be essential for real scientific integrity. So what we have is a lot of public scrutiny of how a lot of this fundamental research that we're now pouring billions and billions of dollars into is not really reproducible or even understandable to an audience outside the original team that did the research. And so let's think for a minute about how we might want to make that type of research reproducible if we buy into this notion that it isn't real science unless you can reproduce it. So we've talked about empirical reproducibility, and that's not really new, and we understand how that works. Computational reproducibility requires a fundamental shift in what we capture, how it gets stored and preserved into the future. And then there's statistical reproducibility, which is a whole topic into itself, where there's so many researchers who rely on statistical methods and algorithms that they themselves don't necessarily understand, and take a lot of things for granted, like the p-value, for example, and what that value should be to be statistically significant. A lot of fields they have a golden rule, like p5, which may or may not be based on any kind of reality of statistical theory. So some examples of this lack of reproducibility, there's one paper from PLOS One recently that talked about the effort that went into attempting to reproduce an experiment. 280 hours for an average user to reproduce the results in the paper, which is a huge amount of effort. This author discovered that the workflows involved are becoming more mature. There were ways for him to observe and at least know what the workflow was in the particular case. But data and software versions and lack of accessibility to them prevent exact reproducibility. So that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today, is how to improve that particular problem. So there's a whole bunch of questions that emerge in this debate, such as who should be reviewing computational findings. Right now, they're not part of the peer review process. And it's not clear who would have the technical expertise to do that from the peer review pool. And is computational replication something that should really happen after the article is published, if needed, or do you really need to do it before a result is published in the first place? How could you inform the community, the scientific community, of the results of your replication? There really are not publications that are designed for research reproducibility per se. So if you did go to the trouble of reproducing an experiment, what is your communication channel to let people know that you were able to reproduce the experiment or that you were not? So we're wondering about things like GitHub as a way of, say, forking a code base and saying, okay, here's the original code and here is what I did to get the same results. So there are people starting to think about that, but it's certainly an unanswered question. Who can review software for validity and accuracy? A lot of people are using code that they didn't write themselves, or people have produced code that they just really barely understand how it works. So who is capable of reviewing that to assess its quality and reliability as part of this publication process? Are there standards for release and reuse of code? Certainly, there are ways that you can release code into the wild through open source mechanisms, but they're not really formal publications. You're just putting them out there for people to use. And how would you know as a researcher that you've got the right version of the code that was used in a particular experiment? It's also interesting because in the world of open source software, what we would consider plagiarism, i.e. taking a code base and then making modifications to fit your situation, that's what we want. But in science and in publishing, it's considered bad behavior. So there are some kind of mismatches between the paradigm of scientific research article publishing and how we treat software and how we think about software. And then following on the code issues are the data issues. Who is responsible for ensuring that data is correct when it is shared as part of this reproducibility. What happens if there is fraud? How do you report that in this ecosystem we have of scholarly publishing? And then there's the statistical issues. A point that I thought was very interesting is that in many, many kinds of experiments, people try lots of statistical approaches that fail, and they only publish the one that worked, which is not really statistically valid as a methodology, and you don't know about all the things that people tried that you shouldn't bother with. So some of our reporting methods really don't work in this new computational science world. And the way that we report experiments and things like data preparation are very non-standard and make it very difficult to reproduce an experiment. So how different are the needs of different fields? Oh, sorry, the final question is, if we did start to develop best practices and standards, how different would they be from one field to the next? And the good news is that there are beginning to be some proposals for how to think about this problem. So Victoria Stodden, the researcher I mentioned, who's done a lot of this work, has a new book out on implementing reproducible research that puts forward a lot of ideas for how we can start to make progress on this. And you'll see this is part of the R series. So she's really focusing there on R code that is fundamental to a lot of research today. And the other good news is that there are beginning to be some new tools that you can use to help support computational research reproducibility. There are platforms for disseminating code and data, things like the Data One platform, which is in the environmental science field, so you may be familiar with that one. Dataverse is a platform they use heavily in the social science data world. And Run My Code is kind of a generic one for software-intensive research. In the workflow tracking arena, there is a few platforms and products that are coming out. Kepler may be known to some of you because Bertram Ludischer, who developed this tool, is at UC Davis and has been working on this for at least 10, maybe 15 years. These are tools that help you encode, capture, and automate your workflows so that they can be rerun automatically. And that seems to be a nice approach, although it can take a lot of work to adapt your own research to this methodology. And then finally, we're starting to see some very cool tools in the traditional publishing arena where you can embed, call them an app or a widget into an article that will actually run the code on the data in the article itself. So that is a way of generating very easily reproducible research, although you can't do anything super complicated yet. But these tools, Sweave, Knitter, and VCR, are examples of researchers who are starting to hack away at this problem. So another good news element is that journals are beginning to step up to thinking about how to motivate researchers to do more of this kind of thing and help them with methodologies and ways of doing it better. So just in the year between 2011 and 12, a number of journals have begun to require as a condition of publication that you share your data. So an early example of that was Nature, who said that if you wanted to cite a gene, it had to be in GenBank so that you could provide the GenBank ID in your research article to make it easier for researchers to find that genomic information when they're reading your article. So lots and lots of journals are starting to say, oh yes, that was a good idea. And you see just increments every year for journals requiring that. Some of them say it's an absolute condition. Some of them say, well, you know, this is a good idea. You should be thinking about it. So there's kind of a range of approaches to that, but it is trending upwards. And perhaps more pertinent to this webinar today, similarly, journals are starting to ask you to share your code as a condition of publication. So this number isn't going up as quickly as the data. And I think that's kind of an indicator that software is even harder than data in some ways to share. And in part, that's because it is a shared good. It's often used by a number of different people, and it has very complex IP issues associated with it and so on. So journals aren't really sure what to do about this, but they are becoming more and more aware that this is a serious flaw in publications related to computational research. In statistical journals, we see that over the past 5 or 6 years, of the number of articles published about computational science, an increasing percentage of them, ranging from 0 in 96 to 21% in 2011, have made their code publicly available at the same time they publish their article. So that's not a huge number, 21%, but it's trending in the right direction. What we are now starting to see is that funding agencies are saying, okay, get with the program. You know, we're funding this research at the tune of billions of dollars, and we expect you to share not just your results, but the tools that people need to really get the benefit of and reproduce your results. So things like the agencies like the NSF have announced that they want investigators to share and freely share, if at all possible, the data and other supporting materials for their research and the software, unless you have a good reason not to. And that policy has actually been in place for quite a while now. More recently, the NSF has introduced a requirement for a data management plan as a condition of funding in new grant proposals. At the beginning, that didn't mean much. They hadn't said anything about what kinds of data management plans they wanted. That is becoming more understood now, and we're starting to see pretty good grant proposals rejected because they didn't have a sufficient data management plan. And a lot of times the software kind of folds under this data management plan as part of the strategy for sharing. Similarly, the NIH has had a policy for a long time now, 10 years, that research that is more than $500,000 in value has to share its final research data. And again, you know, the NIH wasn't enforcing this strictly for many years, but now they really have started to crack down and say that, you know, this is where a lot of the future of research is, so you've got to share your data. Even more recently, we're starting to see the White House get involved. Last year, the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House issued an executive memoranda that told the federal funding agencies that they had to start to mandate plans for public sharing of data and publications. So they didn't mention software specifically, but they're saying that every agency who spends more than, I think it's $100 million in research funding, has to start to make it a requirement for research that you make your publications openly accessible and your data openly accessible so that people can get, can validate the research, as it said in the memorandum, but also get the benefit of having access to the raw data itself. So that has been happening, and the pace of that policy shift in the government is picking up, actually, because I think a lot of agencies have discovered that this is a way to demonstrate better impact and demonstrate the value of the research that they're funding. So now that the government agencies are doing that, we're starting to see more and more journals issue similar policies, not just encouraging people, but PLOS, for example, just recently issued this policy that you have to share data for articles that they publish, and that's generated a huge controversy. They publish many thousands of articles a year in PLOS One, and what this did was kind of tease out the disciplinary differences in attitude about when and how data should be shared, and software goes with that. So what are some of the reasons people aren't sharing? Why is this such a big deal? Well, first of all, most people say that the time it would take to document and clean up their data or their software is a huge barrier. Code, interesting, I think, that code is a higher effort to clean up and document than data. I would have thought it would be the other way around, since so much code is kind of self-documenting. But the perception of researchers is that code is the harder problem, and that's probably because they understand it a little bit less in many cases. Dealing with questions from users. Researchers really do not want to be burdened with tech support for software that they choose to share, or answering, dumb questions about their data. But the only way to avoid that is time-consuming and complex documentation. And even then, you might still have questions. A lot of researchers are concerned about not getting proper credit, and that is a very serious issue. We just had a conference here at UC Davis about this last month, because a lot of researchers have no objection really to sharing their data or their software, but because it takes so much extra effort to clean it up and document it before you share it, if you're not going to get any credit in a promotion and tenure case for that, that's a huge disincentive to sharing correctly. Possibility of patents. This doesn't really come up much with data, but obviously with software, which has the potential for profitability in some cases, that has been a barrier. And sometimes that's not coming from the researcher, but from their institution, who think that there might be reasons to hang on to some code because you might be able to commercialize it with industry. Finally, legal barriers to sharing. A lot of researchers really don't understand how they can share or whether they can share legally, and I'll be spending a little more time on that in a minute, so I'll skip over it now. Related to that is this issue of getting sign-off from the administration or your Office of Research to allow you to share your data. Sometimes data has potential personal issues, what am I trying to say, human subject data, privacy issues, and sometimes you do have to go through laborious sign-off processes with your university administration or your company administration, and that can be an issue for people who don't have much time. Potential loss of future publications and a variety of other things where you sense that there are things that you have not yet yourself gleaned from the data or the software, so you want to kind of hang on to it as long as you can to get that before you share it with other people. This is related to the next one, competitors getting an advantage over you because you were forced to share before you were finished with it yourself. And then, maybe more trivially, but still important, is just not having the physical infrastructure you need. If you have a multi-terabyte data set, you may not have anywhere you can just physically post it in order to share it with other people. So you can kind of get a sense now of why this isn't a simple issue to solve, even though people are increasingly being asked to do it and aware of the reasons why they ought to. So I'm going to pause for a moment there and just see if there are any big questions. And if not, we'll move into some of the more practical things that are happening. I'll just give this a minute. I think there might be a question coming in.
I had one question. A couple slides ago, you had labeled something called a dissemination platform. What exactly characterizes a dissemination platform?
That particular issue was about a platform that lets you post your data on the web. So Data One, for example, is a platform where you can upload research data and sometimes associated code, and then it's cataloged and made available on the web so other people can pick it up and, well, they can find it, first of all, which is often very difficult to do, and then pick it up and download it for their own use or run it in that environment. So the platforms vary from just kind of parking lots or data archives to actual runtime environments where you can reproduce something with the code and the data in the same place. So those were just a few examples of them. There are actually a number of those in different disciplines now. What we don't have are good standards for them, and they don't interoperate with each other across disciplines yet. If there are no other questions, I'll move on to the next section. I'm sorry, I can't see the questions and the slides at the same time, so interrupt me, Lorraine, if there are anything.
Louise was just pointing out that a lot of the barriers that you mentioned have come up many times in your discussions within the computational geophysics community, so they're not strangers to us. We're struggling with those as well.
Right. Right. Yes. No, I think the problems are becoming very well understood now, the barriers, and the fact that there are some tools out there now and more awareness is good, but we really need to start thinking more deeply about some of the fundamental issues, like that credit issue, which is what I'm going to switch into in the next section. So we'll see if these help at all. So I'm characterizing this next section as publishing software and data, but you can think of that as sharing. Publishing just means making something public. So if you post data on a website, you've published it in a sense. And I wanted to spend just a little time talking about intellectual property and this notion of credit, because it's something that most researchers don't understand very well, and I think it comes up again and again in that barriers debate. So I just want to explore with you a little bit what the differences are and what we're really trying to accomplish. So we talk a lot about attribution. And if you've ever shared software under an open source license, then you know that a lot of them mandate attribution. So I'm going to talk about that. But the point is, attribution is a legal concept. And it is legally imposed through a license or similar. And if somebody fails to attribute your work, your only remedy really is to sue them, which is usually not what people intend. Credit is what you want. You want people to know that you did this work, and you want to be able to talk about it in your promotion and tenure cases, and when you're kind of in your CV, you want to be able to get credit and have people recognize what a contribution it was. Citation is how we in the academy have traditionally given credit. So you put citations to work that you've drawn from in your research article, and that's your way of giving credit where credit is due. And so we have to ask ourselves, how are we going to do that for these new kinds of things we're talking about, like data and software? So just keep in mind that attribution as a legal concept does not ensure that you are going to get credit or something you really do care about if you share under certain terms and conditions. So for those of you who have shared data, you know that there really are three ways you can do that. You can slap a license on your data, and that can mandate that you can mandate that other people give you attribution as a result. I'll talk about some of the ways people do that in a moment. Then there are contracts, which can also require attribution, and then there are waivers, which don't require attribution or really anything else. So we're going to talk about all three of these briefly, and you can see the pros and cons of them. For data, copyright usually doesn't apply at all because it's factual in nature, and copyright doesn't apply to facts. Copyright can apply to collections of facts in the way that they are organized, but not to the actual facts themselves, just to the way they're organized and the original aspects of that aggregation. This is US copyright law, I should qualify, not true everywhere in the world. And so even if you have a database that's copyrighted, it would be perfectly legal for people to extract the data from the database, and they're not breaking any laws, as long as they don't keep it intact in the exact arrangement with the schema that you originally used. Licenses are not contracts, even though we use the terminology pretty loosely in science. Licenses depend on some right that you have to your data. So if you have copyright in the data, or if some other right, like a data right, if you happen to be in Europe, you are issuing a license that kind of depends on that copyright or that data right to be legally valid. And copyright is a bundle of rights which are automatic if copyright pertains at all, but limited in scope and duration. So I think you probably all know that copyright expires at some point, and that work, whatever it was, enters the public domain at that point. And so I'll just explain once again that US and EU law differ here, and also other jurisdictions worldwide, in how they think about data. So in this country, it's really quite loose. There really are not many laws that pertain to data except that one database law, and there's no sign that that's going to change in the near future. In Europe, it's a completely different situation. And this has had very significant consequences for international research collaborations, where the data may be jointly produced in multiple legal jurisdictions that have very different views of the degree to which data can be privatized or controlled. And it's often just not clear, but most lawyers say that the most restrictive law wins. And that could cause a lot of problems here in the US. Creative Commons is an example of a license. So this is often applied to software and to texts, but is not usually applied to data because data is not copyrightable. So remember that if you do attach a Creative Commons license to a data set, it may not be legally valid. It's only valid to the extent that the data was copyrightable. And as I said, that's often not the case. And even if it does apply, it's only applying to the degree that you've violated copyright. So uses of data that don't implicate copyright don't trigger the attribution rule. And as I said earlier, attribution, it's not even clear how you could comply with the attribution requirement in a very trivial way that doesn't actually give the creator of the software or the data any credit in the sense that we think of that. So I could stick a notice on a website somewhere that says, oh yeah, and I borrowed this data from Joe. And it's not cited in an article or anything like that, but I've legally complied with the attribution requirement. So one of the things that we know is that it's very hard for a researcher to know whether a particular data set or database is copyrightable. In general, they're not, but sometimes they are. So most scientists are not lawyers and would rather stick hot needles in their eye than learn all of the nuances of this. So they just don't know. And what happens as a result is that we create a lot of risks. Sometimes data providers are misled into thinking that they've covered their bases, but they haven't because they don't understand the nuances of the law. And sometimes data users don't understand what they're agreeing to, so they over or under comply with the conditions that were given to them. So it's just a very confusing situation all around. And as I said, attribution requirements are very inflexible. So you run into these weird situations, like take software, where you may have had hundreds, if not thousands of people contribute lines of code to it over the years. And maybe there's a file somewhere that explains who contributed, but usually not down to the level of which lines of code were contributed by which person. And so at a sort of extreme level, this attribution requirement of something like the CC BY license would require you to give credit to all 1,000 people who contributed to that code base in order to be legally compliant, which is clearly just not useful. So the point of all this is that you can be legally compliant and do exactly what you said you had, or what you were asked to do, but still not be meeting the norms or expectations of the research ecosystem and getting that credit. Contracts are a better tool for that. And what you see with a lot of data is that people impose these data usage agreements instead of using a license. And that's probably a smart thing, but then you run into all kinds of different issues. So contracts don't rely on any kind of copyright or data right. They're just de novo. You can give code or software with a contract on it and impose whatever rules you want through that mechanism. So usually when you do that, there's some sort of click-through license. So if you go to a data archive, there's usually a click-through page where you're agreeing to the data use license agreement, and that's a contract between you and the data provider. And that explains exactly what you have to do in order to get a copy of that data and do anything with it. So what's not great about that is that, if you look at these data usage agreements, they're often written in legalese. They're often long and complicated. We're all well trained not to read them, but just to click through, and just assume that everything's going to be fine. So the downside is that the obligations you're agreeing to can be very confusing. If you're not a lawyer, you may not understand what you've just agreed to. There's no standardization from one data repository or archive to another. So each agreement that you click through might be asking you to do different things. And the problem with that is that then if you try to combine data from multiple sources and you click through different usage agreements to get to that data, you may be agreeing to terms and conditions that directly conflict with each other, and there's no way you could comply with them both. And we run into that situation pretty often these days, which leads researchers to just avoid using data that they find unless they happen to know the producer or the data archive and they know kind of through some other mechanism what they've agreed to. And the other thing that most people don't realize about these use agreements is that they really only bind the people who agreed to it. So when you click through, you personally have agreed to the terms of that contract. But if you turn around and give that data to somebody else, they didn't click through that agreement and they're not legally bound by it. So it's very easy for data to kind of get out into the wild this way unless you can somehow enforce on the first person who got it the rule that they can't share it with anybody else. It gets very complicated. So in this respect, contracts are actually worse than licenses. It gives you more control, but it's way more complicated and way more confusing and often leads to these just no-win situations. There's also the problem that contracts can ask for things that are just ludicrous. This screenshot is not actually the one that I'd like to show, but for a couple of weeks, when Canada decided to implement this open data policy nationally, there was a term on their download page that said, you can't use this data in any way that makes Canada look bad. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but it was so confusing and so absurd that, people just said, what? How are we going to know whether or not this makes Canada look bad? And within a month, they'd had to retract that and rewrite the license. But it just shows you that, you can put anything in these and hope that people know what your intentions were. So often you're taking away rights that people ought to have through these contracts. Waivers are one that the open community, the Creative Commons community, and many others who are pro-sharing think is the best solution. Because it's absolutely certain what you're doing with a waiver is saying, to the extent that I have any rights in this data, I give it up. I promise I'm not going to sue you. I promise I'm not going to come after you. I just give it to the world to do what they want with. And we like this because it's very certain what the consequence is going to be. If you don't say anything, people might assume that you meant it to be publicly available, no strings attached, but they don't know that for a fact. If you provide a waiver, there's just no doubt about your intention. The downside is that you have completely lost control of your data or your software. You can't force anybody to do anything. You can't force them to give you credit. You can't force them to pay you or not charge money themselves, so no control. And the philosophy here is that that's okay because we are a community of scientists and we can self-police. We can develop norms and best practices so that if Joe steals data from Sue and does something with it and doesn't give her credit, we all kind of know that that happened and we stop talking to Joe. So it's pushing it back onto the scientific community to develop their own norms and not over-rely on these legal tools that are really not appropriate for science. This is the Creative Commons CC0 waiver. I've used it for sharing data. It's really easy to apply it to a data set. And there is a fallback license so that if you happen to be in a country like Australia, for example, where there are data laws that are automatically assigned to data, it can fall back to a license that overrules that. Probably didn't explain that very well, but the point is it was hard to develop this waiver because in some countries it's hard to give up your rights to things. You have to be very explicit about that. Luckily, we don't have that issue in the US. So to summarize, the law as a mechanism of controlling data and software is very messy. And there is no perfect approach. You can use a license, but you may or may not know if it's legally enforceable. And it's not necessarily going to get you what you want, which is credit. You can use a contract, which will give you absolute control over what people do with your stuff, but can be very burdensome on them to know what they can and cannot do. And you can easily over-constrain what people are allowed to do with your stuff, which kind of goes against this whole notion of reproducibility. And finally, you can use waivers, which are kind of a perfect legal tool here, but you've totally lost control and you have to rely on the scientific community to behave itself. So each approach has required some loss of control. None of these map perfectly to scholarly credit. And the ideal solution would be the least friction to science, but giving credit where credit is due. So what we recommend as a strategy now is that people apply waivers to their data in particular, and then work on these norms, these social contracts, if you will, for how we're going to behave in different situations with the data. Now let's talk a little bit about citations. This is becoming a well-accepted thing for what we actually do want. We want to be able to assign persistent identifiers to everything, to you as a scientist, to your data, and to your software, so that there is something you can use in a citation. Okay, you have to have an identifier in order to be able to uniquely point to something in a citation. Then there are organizations now like DataCite, which is a nonprofit based in Europe, and they're working on best practices for how you would create an actual citation in a paper to data. And it's very controversial. It works very differently for different kinds of data, but at least there is an organization really focused on that problem now. A knock-on problem then is versioning. So this is a big one with software, right? Where you publish version 1.0, and then 2 weeks later you publish version 1.1. So what is it you're citing? Is it just the code in the abstract, or is it that 1.0 version, or is it the latest version? We've always had kind of issues of that in the library field with editions of books and things, but it's much worse with software. And then I already described that attribution stacking problem of who are you citing? Is it the primary author, the person who first came up with the idea for the software, or is it everybody who's ever contributed to it? Documentation and metadata are absolutely critical to sharing software or data, because if you really don't know what it is or how it was produced, it's not very useful at all. Provenance is a concept that came out of the library world and archives in particular. And it's a fundamental principle we have that talks about how something came to be. What was its chain of custody in the physical world? In the world of software and data, it's more about what exactly did you do to produce this thing? Exactly. This is the whole underpinning of scientific reproducibility, right? If somebody can see exactly what steps you took, then they have a chance of being able to reproduce those, or at least verify that what you did makes sense. So provenance today for us in practical terms has traditionally been in things like lab notebooks, and going forward it's in these automated tools like Kepler, which is the one the Bertram Ludischer is working on here at Davis, and Taverna is based at Southampton University in the UK, and there are various other ones of these, and this is kind of the future of lab notebooks, if you will. And this is what we'll need to support real reproducibility. It is as important as the software and the data itself. You need all three. You need the software, you need the data, and you need this provenance or workflow data. So just to close on the software side of things, software is copyrighted automatically because it happens to be encoded in text. Copyright licenses are often applied to software, and they do support reuse by other users with fairly clear terms and conditions. Versioning is a big issue with software and the licenses that you apply. And again, metadata is super critical to understanding the software. Just getting the code itself really doesn't tell you enough, particularly if time has passed. You need to know what environment it ran in, what language it's in, all kinds of things like that. So there are platforms that you're probably all familiar with for where you can share software, things as basic as GitHub, or OpenSci, which is for R routines that are used particularly in environmental science, Run My Code. So there are a number of these, although we don't really have any norms in science for which ones we prefer, and that is something we ought to be thinking about. Maybe this is a role for libraries, is to start to collect high quality software with documentation so that people know that it's been validated and is supported. So data sharing is a good thing. It ensures all of these great things, that data is trustable, and we need to figure out how to make it sustainable over time. We need to figure out how to make it findable. Just because you posted it on the web doesn't mean anybody will know it's there if you haven't talked about it or promoted it somehow. So this is all the list of things that data sharing comes with as problems that we need to solve. Most data is not copyrightable. I've already talked about that and the mechanisms. Sorry, I guess this is repeating some of what I've already talked about. And places where you can deposit data. You're probably, in your field, familiar with the Dryad database. And that is a place where you can post data that's linked to research articles to comply with journal publishing policies. There are a variety of other of these data archives coming online. The point I wanted to make here is really that just parking your data in something like Amazon S3 or Glacier doesn't really do it, because there's no way to find that data then. It's just archived for your benefit, but really nobody else's. So that doesn't count as sharing. Really, it has to be discoverable. And there's a lot of money going into this now from places like the NIH. They have this large Big Data to Knowledge initiative, part of which is to create a catalog of all the data that is generated out of their research, which will be hosted at the National Library of Medicine and NCBI. So more and more of these data sharing tools, like catalogs of data, are coming online to help. I'm sorry, I'm kind of rushing through the rest of this now because I was talking too slowly. The NIH's view of this world is that there are really these attributes of the academic digital enterprise. You've got your digital assets, which are your data, your articles related to your research, your software, and your lab notes or workflows. And then each of those should be identified uniquely with some kind of metadata that tells you how it was produced, and that those need to be interoperable across the enterprise. So we are not even close to this vision yet, but this is what the NIH wants to see happen and has created this directorate for data science to try to work on. So I just want to close very briefly with a few thoughts to keep you up at night about digital preservation in this environment. So for software, the story isn't too bad. Software is textual in nature, so it is trivially preservable as a digital object, as long as there's something like metadata so that you can interpret it in the future. So as long as you've got the text and the metadata, you're okay. What keeps me up at night are proprietary software systems like AutoCAD, right? That I spent a few years working on how to preserve these 3D modeling systems and the models that come out of them. And it's a nightmare because the companies that produce these are deliberately making them not backwards compatible. So your data is only as good as which version you use, which version of the tool you use to produce it. And the tools are upgraded approximately every 5 years. So preserving something like a 3D model into the future is just a nightmare. And there are some standards for ways you can export the data, but they're all quite lossy. So when you talk about software preservation, things like CAD softwares or video games are the worst case scenario. But fortunately, a lot of things like R routines fall into the much easier category. With data, the preservable object is the raw or the processed data, depending on your field. And where we went into issues there is that it's often not just a single file of information like an Excel spreadsheet. It can be a very complex set of files that are interrelated in complex ways, like a 3D model. And those can be very difficult to preserve. So what we're trying to do is develop some best practices for what format to use in different situations and insist on good documentation with the data. And again, that varies according to what type of data you have and what domain you're in. And the worst case scenario in that world is these databases that are updated in real time, so they're changing every second. What is it you're preserving in that case? Do you take a snapshot every day? You know, that's a huge amount of storage. So we really don't even know in that case what it is we need to preserve for the future. And then the workflows are, again, trivially easy to preserve, but because there are no standards for them yet, each workflow could look a little different, and they're only as good as your ability to interpret them in the future and understand what they're trying to tell you. So preservation is something that is being actively worked on, but is far from a solved problem. And if we're talking about reproducible research, this is going to be a big issue. You can only reproduce the research for a few years or until these software and data sets expire. And sorry, I kind of ran out of time there. I will stop now, and if there are any questions, I have a couple of minutes to answer them. I see there's one from Anna. Lack of credit is a big problem. Is anything going on to establish and allow streamlined DOI assignments to data and code? The answer is yes. There are several efforts, including the one I mentioned, DataCite, that is working with the DOI community to figure out how to assign DOIs to data sets and associate those with metadata to create a citable thing. So go and check out the DataCite website for that. Despite the problems, people are often happy to share their code and data. I agree with that. But many still want industry to respect a commercial license. Absolutely, I hear that all the time. If code and data are used, if we have no publishing tools for this, since all of our dissemination repositories don't want to deal with anything not simple open source. Yes, so this is why so many of the data archives or code repositories are implementing these contracts, the usage license agreements. And what I would like to see happen is for Creative Commons or similar kinds of organizations to develop some standardized data usage license agreements or data usage agreements, so that there start to be some things that are comparable to the CC licenses, but for data, that can impose these kinds of restrictions on sectors like industry. There's a non-commercial clause in the CC licenses for articles, and we could come up with the analog of that for data. The culture of allocating credit for software in geophysics has changed considerably. A decade or so, code was not routinely named in publications. Any advice on how to look backward? Wow, that is a really hard problem. I actually think the only way we could do that is with text mining, to go back and see if a particular software package was mentioned in the article. How we would then retroactively give credit to the person who created that software is a very tough problem. We don't really have credit mechanisms that are outside the formal publications. But at least then you could say, run a text mining routine, find all the articles that mentioned your code, and you yourself could put that into your CV. That's a great problem. Got a couple of questions coming in.
Because Eric is typing. I thought it was very interesting that some people are starting to embed their software in their articles so that you could actually run it. How does this work when you're using HPC resources? I mean, that's not going to be a standard that can be broadly applied.
Right. In those cases, those tools would not do anything that sophisticated. But you could imagine a day when you can link out from an article to an HPC environment that's running in the web or in the cloud. Like if you had some code running in S3 and it was reachable through some kind of public URL, then you could link out from the article to it. So I'm not claiming that environment really exists, but these tools like Swerve are really, Sweave are proof of concept. And there's a whole group called, I think it's Force 11, PDF of the Future, a couple of different initiatives that are looking at what the next generation of research articles ought to look like so that they can start to embed the whole computational infrastructure that they're talking about. And in that world, the article is just metadata about the research. Okay, Eric's question was, given that software may give different results on different platforms, yep, what methods are available? Well, this is where the workflow comes in, right? The provenance. If you've documented exactly what you did, then people will at least know how different the environment they're running it in is. And this is coming up over and over. I was just talking to Jonathan Eisen here, who's a biologist at Davis, and he made the point that a lot of biology experiments are being written off as fraud because they can't be reproduced, but that's because the physical environment that they're being replicated in is different from the original physical environment. There are different microbes in the environment, and they're generating different results. So there's questions about whether some research is in fact reproducible at all. Fortunately, it's not that bad with the kind of research you're talking about. Yeah, right. So the point that you can link out to a virtual machine for reproducibility is absolutely true. We haven't seen that happening a lot in practice, but that is exactly what we should be trying to do experimentally. And then get publishers to participate in some experiments to see how we would put those into the articles and then preserve that whole environment. Okay, well, I don't see any more questions coming in right now, and we're over time, so I'd like to thank everybody for coming. And thank you, Lorraine, for organizing this. And I hope it was useful.
This was very good. Thank you, MacKenzie. You gave us a lot to talk about and a lot of things to think about. It was good to see